Hey everybody, and welcome to this deep dive. We're going to be talking about some really cool stuff in French grammar today.
That's right.
Specifically, we're going to be looking at the pronunciator material on common spelling changes and rules in conjugation.
Definitely. And you know what's great about this topic?
What's that?
It can be a little overwhelming, right? All these rules and exceptions.
It really can.
But once you start to see those patterns and the logic behind these changes, it really opens up a whole new level of understanding of the French language.
That's so true. And I know that our listeners out there who are working on their pronunciator certificates, they're really eager to kind of get a deeper understanding of these rules.
Absolutely.
So let's dive in. Where should we start?
Well, let's start with the basics.
Okay.
You know, we've got our regular verbs, those irregular verbs.
Right. The workhorses of the French language.
Exactly. And they're mostly straightforward.
They are, but even they have some little quirks.
Yeah, for sure. Especially when you start talking about different tenses, like the passé simple.
Oh, yes, the passé simple. I remember struggling with those endings.
And of course, don't forget about plural forms.
Right. Those plural forms always seem to throw in a little extra something.
They do. They like to keep us on our toes.
For sure. Okay, so we've got regular verbs, but then we have those other verbs that like to shake things up a bit.
You mean the stem-changing verbs?
Exactly, like the ones ending in eeler and eater.
Right. Those are the ones where the E in the stem can sometimes become E.
Yes, and it always seems so random to me.
I know it can feel that way, but trust me, there's a method to the madness.
Oh, I'm sure there is. I just haven't quite figured it out yet.
Well, that's what we're here for, to unlock those mysteries.
I can't wait. And then, of course, we can't forget about the irregular verbs.
Yes, the rebels of French conjugation.
They always seem to break all the rules.
They do seem to have a mind of their own, but even they have their own internal logic.
Oh, really? I always thought they were just completely random.
Not at all. Yeah. Once you understand their patterns, they become much easier to handle.
Well, I'm ready for the challenge. Bring on those irregular verbs.
All right, let's start by breaking down those regular verb endings. They're a good foundation because they follow predictable patterns across different tenses and subject pronouns.
Okay, so if we take a regular verb, like parlor, to speak.
Exactly.
In the present tense, you just add the endings, ils, ils, dans un, to the stem part.
You got it.
So it's je parle, tu parles, il, elle parle.
Nous parlons, vous parlez, ils, elles parlent.
Perfect. You see the pattern.
I do. And it's the same principle for regular and verbs, right? Just with different endings.
Precisely. It's all about recognizing those patterns.
Okay, so regular verbs, we're starting to get a handle on those.
Great.
But what about the passé simple? I've heard that can be a bit of a beast.
It does have its own set of unique endings, but don't worry, once you learn them, they're pretty straightforward to apply.
Okay, so for verbs in the passé simple,
you would use endings like a, as, a, ems, irent.
Wow, those look a lot different from the present tense endings. They do, but the good news is they're consistent for all regular verbs. And the same goes for and verbs. They have their own specific passé simple endings.
So it's like learning a new set of dance steps for each verb group in the passé simple.
I like that analogy.
It's all about finding the rhythm.
Exactly. And once you've got the steps down, you'll be waltzing through the passé simple with ease.
I love it. I'm already feeling more confident about these verb endings. It's amazing how breaking them down into patterns makes them so much less intimidating.
Absolutely. That's the key to see the logic behind these changes rather than just memorizing a bunch of random rules.
Okay, so we've got those regular verb endings under our belt. Now, what about those stem-changing verbs? You mentioned and verbs earlier. What makes them so special?
Well, these verbs are fascinating because they change their stem depending on the subject and tense. Specifically, the E in the stem can transform into A in certain forms, and it all comes down to where the stress falls in the word.
So it's like the verb is emphasizing certain syllables by changing its spelling.
Precisely. Let's take the verb acheter, meaning to buy, as an example. When the stress falls on the stem, that E becomes E. So we have j'achète, tu achètes, il, elle achète.
Okay, I see the pattern there, but then what happens in the plural forms?
Oh, in the plural forms, the stress shifts a bit. So we have nous achetons, vous achetez, ils, elles achètent.
Wait, so the E only changes to A in the singular forms.
You got it. It's all about maintaining that consistent stress on the stem.
Wow, that's so cool. I never realized there was such a specific reason behind those spelling changes.
There always is. And this focus on pronunciation and smooth transitions is a hallmark of French grammar.
This is making me look at French verbs in a whole new light. It's not just about memorizing endings, it's about understanding the why behind the what.
Exactly. And that understanding is what will truly unlock fluency. and help you appreciate the elegance of the French language.
I'm starting to see that. So we've covered regular verbs and those shape-shifting, stem-changing verbs. What's next on our conjugation adventure?
Well, now we face the rebels of the French language, the irregular verbs.
Oh, boy. Here we go.
But don't worry, they're not as scary as they seem. They just march to the beat of their own drum.
I'm ready for the challenge. Bring on the irregulars.
All right, so we're talking irregular verbs. Now, I know some of these verbs can seem really intimidating.
They really can. You look at a verb like a whimper to go, and it's like, where did all those endings come from?
Right, it seems to completely change its form in different tenses.
Exactly.
But here's the thing about irregular verbs.
Yeah.
They might seem random, but they actually follow patterns.
They do.
They do. Just like those regular verbs we talked about. It's just that their patterns are unique to each verb.
So it's like each irregular verb has its own little personality.
I like that way of putting it.
So instead of looking for that one-size-fits-all formula, we need to get to know each irregular verb individually.
Precisely. And often those quirks, those individual patterns, they actually have historical roots.
Oh, really?
Yeah. For example, the verb et, to be.
Okay.
It actually comes from two different Latin verbs, which is why it has such an unusual conjugation pattern.
Wow. So it's like we're learning little pieces of linguistic history when we study these irregular verbs.
Exactly. It's like a treasure hunt through time.
I love that. Okay, so we're starting to see these irregular verbs as less intimidating. But with so many of them, where do we even begin?
Well, a good starting point is to group them together based on shared patterns.
Oh, so kind of like we did with the regular verb.
Exactly. For example, a lot of irregular verbs that end in ir,
okay,
partir, to leave, and dormir, to sleep.
Okay.
They follow similar stem changes in the present tense.
So instead of memorizing dozens of individual conjugations, we can look for those common patterns.
Precisely. It's all about simplifying the process.
Right.
And the more you practice, the more these patterns will become second nature.
This is starting to feel a lot less overwhelming.
That's great to hear.
Okay, so we've got those irregular verbs somewhat under control.
We're getting there.
What other spelling challenges should we be aware of in French conjugation?
Well, let's talk about reflexive verbs. They can be a bit tricky, especially when they start with a vowel or a silent H.
Right. Those are the verbs where we use reflexive pronouns like métisseau and so on.
Exactly. And when these pronouns come before a verb that starts with a vowel or a silent H, we make a little adjustment.
Okay.
To avoid an awkward vowel clash.
It's like we're smoothing out the pronunciation.
Precisely. So instead of using the full pronoun je, we shorten it to je before the verb.
Okay, so like with the verb s'appeler.
Yes. Instead of saying je m'appelle, I call myself, we say je m'appelle.
Right. That apostrophe makes all the difference.
It does. It creates a much more seamless flow.
It's amazing how such a small spelling change can have such a big impact on the way a word sounds.
Absolutely. And that attention to detail, that focus on preserving the musicality of the language, it's what makes French so beautiful and captivating to learn.
I'm really starting to appreciate that aspect of French grammar. It's not just about rules, it's about creating a harmonious and elegant sound.
Exactly. Now, are you ready for another round of spelling intrigue?
Bring it on. I'm feeling like a true conjugation detective, ready to crack the code of these spelling changes.
Excellent. Then let's delve into the fascinating world of double consonants in French conjugation.
Double consonants. Now, those sound like trouble.
They can be tricky, but like everything else we've talked about, once you understand the why behind them, they become much easier to manage.
Okay, I'm listening.
So double consonants often pop up when we conjugate verbs ending in -er or -eter.
Like jitter to throw or appeller to call?
Exactly. And remember, these verbs, they already have those stem changes we talked about earlier.
Right, where the E can become E.
Exactly. So in addition to those stem changes, they also like to double their final consonant before adding those endings E, E, S, on.
Okay, so instead of jet, jet, jeton, we have jet, jet, jet.
You got it. And instead of appel, appelles, appellant, we have appel, appels, appellant.
Wow, that's a lot of consonants all clustered together.
It is. But there's a reason for it. You see, those double consonants, they actually prevent the preceding vowel from becoming too long and drawn out.
So it's like they're adding a little extra emphasis to those syllables.
Exactly. They keep the pronunciation sharp and precise.
I never realized how much thought goes into these seemingly small spelling changes.
There's a reason for everything. And remember that attention to phonetic detail, it's what makes French conjugation so fascinating and rewarding to learn.
I'm definitely starting to see that. Okay, so we've covered double consonants. What other spelling adventures await us on this conjugation journey?
Well, let's explore a few more specific cases. For example, verbs that end in jur and ser.
Oh, those are tricky ones.
They can be, but they just want to keep their soft sounds.
So like with major to eat?
Exactly. We don't want that harsh G sound.
Right.
So to preserve that soft G sound, we add an E before the endings that start with A or O.
So the nous form becomes mangens instead of mangans.
Exactly. It's like we're giving that G a little cushion so it doesn't bump into those vowels too harshly.
It's all about maintaining that smooth flowing French sound.
Precisely. And this attention to phonetic harmony, it also extends to verbs ending in cher. Oh, right, like payer to pay.
Exactly. They have a couple of options when it comes to certain pronouns.
So we can either keep the Y or replace it with an I before those endings EES.
You got it. So we can have paie pays payant or paie pays payant. Both are correct, although the I option is more common these days. So it's really a matter of style.
Exactly. It's all about finding the form that feels most natural and comfortable to you.
I love that flexibility.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we've covered diger and titir verbs. What else is there?
Well, we've got one last set of verbs to look at before we wrap up this part of our deep dive.
Okay, bring it on.
These are verbs that have stems ending in et or in ine,
Okay.
like venir to come and tinir to hold.
Okay.
They have a little trick up their sleeve when they're conjugated with the pronouns il, elle, or on.
What do they do?
Well, instead of adding the usual ending directly to the stem, they drop that final T or N before adding the ending.
So like with venir, instead of il venit, elle venit, on venit,
Right.
becomes il vient, elle vient, on vient.
Exactly. And tinir becomes il tient, elle tient, on tient.
So it's like they're streamlining their form to create a smoother sound.
You got it. It's all about that effortless flow that characterizes spoken French. And this attention to detail, it's what makes French conjugation so fascinating and rewarding to learn.
I'm starting to see that. Every spelling change has a purpose, a reason for being. It's not just random. It's all about creating a beautiful and harmonious language.
You've put it perfectly. And the more you understand these reasons, the more you'll appreciate the elegance and logic of French grammar. Now let's take a little break to let all this information sink in. And when we come back, we'll wrap up our deep dive with a few final tips and insights to help you ace that pronunciator certificate.
Okay, so we're back and ready to wrap up our deep dive into French conjugation.
We've covered a lot of ground, but there are still a few more gems to uncover.
I'm all ears.
Let's talk about present participles for a moment.
Okay.
They can have some unique spelling quirks, especially when we're dealing with EA verbs.
Oh yeah, those eerie verbs always sound so fancy to me. Like crier to shout or plier to fold.
Yeah. They do have a certain elegance to them, don't they? And their present participles are no exception.
So what's the trick with those?
Well, the key is to remember that when you're forming the present participle of an EA verb, you drop the I before adding the ant ending.
So for crier, it would be criant, not criant.
Exactly. And for plier, it would be pliant, not pliant.
Got it. It's like they're shedding a letter to become even more graceful.
I like that way of thinking about it. Now let's shift gears for a moment and talk about those essential helpers in French conjugation, the auxiliary verbs être and avoir.
Ah, yes. Those trusty companions that help us form compound tenses. I remember learning that some verbs use être as their auxiliary, while others use avoir, but the rules always seemed a bit fuzzy.
It's true, the rules can be tricky, but once you grasp the basic principles, it becomes much clearer.
Okay, so break it down for me.
The key is to understand the type of verb you're dealing with. For example, reflexive verbs.
Okay.
They always use être as their auxiliary.
So verbs like se lever to get up or se promener to take a walk.
Exactly. And verbs of motion, like aller to go and venir to come, also typically use être.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So what about verbs that use avoir as their auxiliary?
Well, most transitive verbs, those verbs that take a direct object, they use avoir.
Okay.
For instance, verbs like manger, to eat, lire, to read, and écrire, to write.
Ah, so if a verb has a direct object, it's probably using avoir as its auxiliary.
That's a good rule of thumb to remember.
Yeah.
And remember, mastering these auxiliary verbs is crucial for forming those compound tenses like the passé composé.
Which is super important for talking about past events.
Exactly.
This is all starting to click into place. I feel like I'm finally seeing the bigger picture of French conjugation and how all these seemingly random pieces actually fit together so beautifully.
That's wonderful to hear. And remember, even though we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, the journey of mastering French conjugation is an ongoing one. Keep practicing, keep exploring those verbs, and don't be afraid to make mistakes along the way. That's how we learn and grow.
It's so true. Well, I want to thank you so much for guiding us through this incredible deep dive into the world of French verbs.
It's been my pleasure.
I feel much more confident and prepared to tackle those pronunciator challenges now. And to all our listeners out there, keep practicing those verbs. That pronunciator certificate is within your reach. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into French conjugation, and we'll see you next time.